Marriage is supposed to mean loyalty. The woman who stands beside you at the altar, who shares your name, your bed, your bank account, who sits across from you at dinner every night and says she loves you, is supposed to be the one person in the world who is unambiguously on your side. She is the one you call first. She is the one who knows where you are going and when you will be home. She is the one who files the missing persons report, who cries at the funeral, who collects the life insurance and moves forward. But for the men in these cases, the woman who was supposed to be on their side was the reason they never came home. She planned it. She arranged it. She covered it. She stood at the graveside with everyone else and let the world believe what she needed it to believe. The cover-up was not a separate act. It was the marriage itself, performed until the evidence ran out. Today we are covering 10 wives who helped bury the truth. Case 1. Pamela Smart. The condominium at 4E Misty Morning Drive in Derry, New Hampshire, looked like a burglary had gone wrong. On the evening of May 1st, 1990, the front door had been forced, drawers had been pulled open, jewellery was missing from the bedroom, a stereo had been stacked near the door, as though someone had planned to carry it out and then thought better of it. Greg Smart, 24 years old, an insurance salesman who had grown up in Londonderry and spent the last year of his life in this condominium with his wife, was on the floor of the foyer, a single gunshot wound to the head. The family dog had been locked in the basement. Derry police and detectives from the State Police Major Crimes Unit arrived and began working the scene. The staging was thorough enough to read as a robbery, interrupted when the homeowner came through the door. Nothing immediately pointed elsewhere. When Pamela Smart arrived home from a work meeting that evening, she pounded on her neighbours' doors until someone called the police. She was 22 years old. She worked as a media services coordinator at Winnacunnet High School in Hampton. She had a communications degree from Florida State University, where she had graduated with honours, and she had ambitions in television journalism. She described herself later as someone who wanted to be the next Barbara Walters. She was small, blonde, careful about how she presented herself, and by every external measure, the kind of person who managed impressions deliberately and well. She had met Greg Smart when she was still a teenager. They crossed paths at a New Year's Eve party at the Smart family home and started dating while Pamela was in high school. They stayed together through her years at Florida State. He was born in Nashua on September 4th, 1965, the second of 3 sons, and he had followed his father into insurance sales, working for Metropolitan Life in Nashua. Greg Smart was the kind of person people described with words like all-American. He liked his job. He liked his family. He was known by his friends as steady and good-natured, not complicated. They married on May 3rd, 1989, and he moved to Florida to be with Pamela for her senior year before they came north together when she took the job in New Hampshire. 7 months into the marriage, things had started to come apart. Greg had started smoking again after promising to stop. There had been an incident at a party involving another woman. Pamela moved out briefly and went to stay somewhere else. She moved back. The reconciliation settled on the surface, but not underneath. By the spring of 1990, they were still living together at Misty Morning Drive, still technically married, but the marriage Pamela had expected was not the one she was living in. She had met William Flynn in the fall of 1989. He was 15 years old, a sophomore at Winnacunnet High School, enrolled in a school drug awareness program called Project Self-Esteem, where Pamela also volunteered. A 16-year-old student intern named Cecilia Pierce worked in Pamela's media office and knew Flynn through school. Pierce introduced them. Flynn was, by the accounts of people who knew him then, a devoted teenager with the particular quality of someone who attached himself completely to the first person who seemed to offer something real. He liked heavy metal music. So did Pamela. Motley Crue, Van Halen. He was 15 and she was 22, and she worked in his school building, and by February 1990, they were sleeping together at her apartment, while Greg was away on work trips. The relationship ran through the winter and into the spring. At some point during those months, the conversation shifted in a direction Flynn would describe in detail on a witness stand the following year. Pamela began telling him that her marriage was a problem she could not solve through ordinary means. A divorce would be financially ruinous. There was the house, the car, a $140,000 life insurance policy she had taken out on Greg's life. She told Flynn that the math did not work in her favour if Greg lived. She also told him that she needed to know whether he loved her, and that his answer to this question had a practical implication. And she told him that if he could not do what she needed, she would end their relationship and he would lose her. He believed all of it. Flynn recruited 3 friends. Patrick Randall, 17, would be inside the house with him. Vance Latime Jr., who had stolen a .38 caliber pistol from his own father's home, would drive. Raymond Fowler, 18, would wait in the car. The plan was mechanical in its setup. Pamela would leave the basement bulkhead doors unlocked. Flynn and Randall would enter before Greg came home, wait, and do what Flynn had agreed to do. In late April 1990, Flynn made a first attempt. He got lost on the way to Derry, ran out of time, and told Pamela afterward that he had panicked. She was not sympathetic. She told him it had to happen. She told him the window was closing. She told him she was counting on him. And then she told him again what was at stake for both of them if he failed to follow through. On May 1st, 1990, Pamela drove Flynn and 2 of his friends to Haverhill, Massachusetts, to pick up a car that could not be connected to any of them. She had arranged her own alibi with precision. That afternoon she had lunch with approximately 12 co-workers at the Library restaurant in downtown Portsmouth. She remained there, visible, accounted for, through the hours when everything was happening in Derry. The teenagers drove to Derry, ate pizza at a local restaurant, and waited for dark. They entered the condominium through the unlocked bulkhead. When Greg Smart came home that evening, Randall was already inside the foyer. He put a knife to Greg's throat and forced him to his knees on the floor. Greg Smart begged for his life. He was still begging when Flynn pressed the .38 caliber pistol to the back of his head. Flynn testified later that before he pulled the trigger, he said the words, "God forgive me," nearly whispering them. He said he stood there for what felt like 100 years before he fired. Then he fired. The teenagers staged the scene to look like a burglary, locked the dog in the basement, and left. Pamela Smart was in Portsmouth when her husband was on the floor of his own foyer. 12 people could account for her. She came home to find him. She screamed. She knocked on doors until someone called 911. In the days that followed, she was publicly, visibly devastated. She gave press interviews. She attended the funeral. She involved herself in the community's response to the crime, making statements about the need for answers, about the loss of a young man, about her own grief. She behaved exactly as a 22-year-old widow struggling to hold herself together might be expected to behave. She did it so precisely and so persistently that investigators began to ask whether any of it was real. The case broke in June 1990, and it broke because of a gun. Vance Latime's father found a .38 caliber pistol in his house that he had not put there and brought it to the police, believing it might be connected to the Smart murder. On June 10th, detectives arrested Flynn, Latime and Randall and charged all 3 with first-degree murder. They were not cooperative initially. Prosecutors announced they intended to try all 3 as adults, which meant each of them faced life in prison without parole. That changed everything. Within weeks, they began to cooperate. The investigators' attention had also moved to Cecilia Pierce. She was 16 years old, a student intern in Pamela's media office, and close enough to Pamela to know things. Detectives approached her. Pierce agreed to help. She spent weeks in phone conversations with Pamela that were recorded on law enforcement equipment, pulling at the edges of what Pamela might say. When the phone recordings did not produce enough, she agreed to wear a wire. On July 12th and 13th, 1990, Pierce visited Pamela at her school office at Winnacunnet and sat with her while recordings ran. During one of those conversations, Pamela told Pierce that if Pierce told the truth, she would send Pamela to prison for the rest of her life. She then told Pierce that telling the truth would make Pierce herself an accessory to the crime. On another occasion, Pamela said the line that would define the prosecution's case. If the whole truth came out, they would all be going to the slammer for the rest of their entire lives. She also told Pierce that Raymond Fowler's big mouth was the only reason this had not been a perfect murder. On August 1st, 1990, Detective Daniel Pelletier approached Pamela Smart in the parking lot outside her school. She had spoken to him before and recognised him. She asked what was happening. He told her there was good news and bad news. The good news was that her husband's case had been solved. The bad news was that she was under arrest for first-degree murder. She was handcuffed in the parking lot and transported to the New Hampshire State Prison for Women in Goffstown. Her trial opened on March 4, 1991, at the Rockingham County Superior Court in Exeter, before Judge Douglas Gray. It became the first murder trial in American history to be broadcast gavel to gavel on live television. The courtroom was full every day. The proceedings ran for 14 days. Assistant State Attorney General Diane Nicolosi gave the prosecution's opening statement and framed Pamela Smart as a cold-blooded architect. On May 1, 1990, she told the jury, "Greg Smart came home from a late meeting, opened his front door, turned on his lights, and called for his dog. His dog did not respond." Flynn took the stand early in the trial and recounted the whole of it, kneeling before the jury to show them the position Greg was in when the shot was fired. He described Pamela telling him that the marriage had to end, that a divorce would take everything from her, that he needed to do this if he loved her. He said he was in love with her and that his feelings for her were what made him go through with it. He sobbed at multiple points during his testimony. Vance Latime Jr. told the jury that Pamela had given him a pair of stereo speakers and promised an additional $250 for his role in the planning. He also told them that before the night of May 1st, Pamela had asked the group how she should act when she came home and found her husband's body. She did not know whether to scream, run from house to house, or call the police. They told her to act normal. Latime also testified to a specific detail the prosecution considered significant. Pamela had insisted that Greg be shot rather than stabbed because she did not want blood on her white furniture. Cecilia Pierce testified about the wire recordings and the conversations she had sat through while the equipment ran. The defense countered that Pierce had sold the rights to her story to a Hollywood production company for a sum reported to be around $100,000, which called her credibility into question. Defense attorneys Mark Sisti and Paul Twomey argued that the teenagers had acted independently, that Flynn had become obsessively attached to Pamela and had concocted the story of a plot to reduce his own sentence. Pamela took the stand herself. She acknowledged the affair with Flynn, but insisted she had known nothing about any plan to harm Greg. She said her attempts to end the relationship had been met with Flynn's threats of suicide, that she had been trying to repair her marriage, and that the taped conversations with Pierce were part of her own private effort to investigate what had happened to her husband. When the prosecutor asked what she had been planning to do with what she learned, whether she planned to make a citizen's arrest, she said yes. The jury of 7 women and 5 men deliberated for 13 hours across 3 days. On March 22, 1991, jury forewoman Norma Honor read the verdict. Guilty on all 3 counts: accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and witness tampering. Pamela Smart stood emotionless as the foreman read each count. When Judge Douglas Gray imposed a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole, she appeared, by the accounts of observers in the courtroom that day, equally unmoved. Flynn was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 28 years. Randall received life with parole eligibility after 40 years. Latime was sentenced to life with parole eligibility after 18 years. Fowler, who had waited in the car, received 30 years on charges of conspiracy and attempted burglary and was paroled in 2003. Flynn was released on June 4, 2015. Randall was released the same day. Latime followed. Every teenager who entered that condominium served his sentence and came home. The woman the jury found to have planned and arranged all of it has never left. Pamela Smart is currently held at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in Westchester County, New York, a maximum security prison to which she was transferred for security reasons. She has earned a doctorate in ministry and multiple master's degrees behind bars. She has tutored other inmates and been ordained as a minister. For more than 3 decades, she maintained her innocence in every public forum and every legal filing. In June 2024, she released a videotaped statement recorded during a prison writing workshop in which she accepted, for the first time publicly, that she was responsible for Greg's death. She said she had spent years deflecting blame as a coping mechanism because the truth of being so responsible was very difficult for her to face. She asked New Hampshire Governor Kelly Ayotte for a commutation hearing. In May 2025, the governor rejected the request. Greg Smart was 24 years old. He and Pamela had been married for less than a year when she left the basement doors unlocked. His father, William Smart, has attended parole and commutation hearings for more than 30 years. Greg's brother Dean wrote a memoir about the experience of living in the aftermath of that night. The case inspired a 1991 television movie, a 1992 novel, and a 1995 film starring Nicole Kidman. The trial footage still circulates. The woman who arranged it remains at Bedford Hills, where she has been since 1993, the only person connected to the night of May 1st, 1990, who has not come home. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. These first two cases have something in common. Both women kept themselves at a physical distance from the act while making certain it happened. The planning was theirs. The execution belonged to someone else. The next case unfolded differently. Stacy Castor did not arrange for anyone else to do what she had decided to do. She did it herself, twice, with the same substance and the same patience. And when investigators came too close, she reached for a third. Case 2. Stacy Castor. On the morning of August 22, 2005, Stacy Castor called 911 from her home in the Liverpool area of Syracuse, New York, to report that her husband David had not shown up for work and she could not get into the bedroom. A responding officer pried the locked door open. David Castor, 48 years old, was found naked and unresponsive in bed. On the nightstand beside him was a glass of green liquid. On the floor was a jug of antifreeze. There was no note. The medical examiner concluded that David had died from ethylene glycol poisoning and initially ruled it a suicide. Investigators were not convinced. David Castor ran a heating and air conditioning business in the Syracuse area. He had met Stacy in 2001 when he hired her to work for his company. She was 33 at the time, a divorcee with 2 teenage daughters from her first marriage. They dated, married, and by most outward appearances, settled into the rhythms of a working couple in central New York. People who knew them said David had been depressed in the months before his death, following the loss of his father. Stacy offered that as context when she spoke to investigators. She said they had both been watching a television news segment around that time about a woman named Lynn Turner who had poisoned 2 men with antifreeze, and that David had commented on it. That detail would resurface at trial. What investigators found at the scene did not fit a suicide in several important ways. David Castor's fingerprints were not on the glass of antifreeze on the nightstand. Stacy's fingerprints were the only ones on it. In the kitchen trash, investigators found a turkey baster. The baster tested positive for both ethylene glycol and David Castor's DNA. The forensic picture that emerged was not of a man who had drunk antifreeze voluntarily. It was of a man who had been administered it through the baster, likely while he was asleep or incapacitated, over a period of several days. Prosecutors would later argue that Stacy had poisoned David across a 4-day Labor Day weekend, working through the holiday while he deteriorated, and then staged the bedroom to suggest he had made the decision himself. The case was ruled a homicide. Stacy Castor was not immediately charged. Investigators wanted to build what they had before moving, and they had a question they needed to answer first, about a man who had died 5 years earlier. Stacy Castor's first husband was Michael Wallace. She had met him in 1984 when she was 17 years old, in the town of Weedsport in Cayuga County, about 20 miles west of Syracuse. They married and had 2 daughters together, Ashley and Bree. In January 2000, Michael Wallace died at home at the age of 38. His death was attributed to a heart attack. No autopsy was performed because Stacy requested that one not be done. He was buried in Weedsport. 3 months before he died, his doctor had noted that he reported feeling drunk despite not having consumed any alcohol. Nobody connected that symptom to anything at the time. After Michael's death, Stacy moved into David Castor's life. She had collected on Michael's life insurance. She had also, records later showed, changed David Castor's will before his death in a way that excluded his son from a previous marriage from the inheritance David had originally intended for him. The money ran in one direction in each of these relationships, and that direction was towards Stacy. In September 2007, investigators in Onondaga County working the David Castor homicide coordinated with authorities in Cayuga County to exhume Michael Wallace's body. The exhumation was done without Stacy's knowledge, deliberately, so she would not have time to prepare for what the results might mean. A few days after the procedure, Sergeant Michael Norton of the Onondaga County Sheriff's Office received a call from the medical examiner. The examiner told him that Michael Wallace's organs were loaded with crystals. Ethylene glycol poisoning causes calcium oxalate crystals to form in the kidneys and other organs, and those crystals do not dissolve or disappear. They were still there, 7 years after Michael Wallace had been buried. The medical examiner in Cayuga County reclassified his death as a homicide. Investigators now believed they had 2 homicides connected to the same woman by the same method. They began building toward an arrest. On the first day of Ashley Wallace's college orientation in September 2007, 2 investigators approached her at school and told her that her father Michael had been poisoned. They asked her questions about the circumstances of his death. Ashley was shaken and called her mother immediately after. What Stacy did in response to that phone call is the part of this case that separates it from most of the others. Within days of Ashley's conversation with investigators, Stacy invited her daughter to come to the family home in Liverpool and have drinks together. Ashley agreed without hesitation. Stacy was not only her mother, she was, Ashley said later, her best friend. The following day, Stacy invited her back again and offered her what Ashley described as a nasty-tasting drink. Ashley initially declined. At some point, she consumed enough of it. 17 hours later, Ashley's younger sister Bree found her comatose in bed and demanded that their mother call for help. Stacy made the 911 call. Bree also found something else before the ambulance arrived. There was a piece of paper in Ashley's room. It appeared to be a suicide note. It ran more than 750 words and was typed. It contained what read as a confession to the murders of both Michael Wallace and David Castor, signed with Ashley Wallace's name. Tests at the hospital found a toxic combination of prescription medications in Ashley's system. Investigators calculated that she had ingested enough to have died if she had arrived at the hospital any later than she did. She survived, but barely. When she regained consciousness and police questioned her about the note and the overdose, she said she had no memory of writing any note, and the last thing she remembered was drinking with her mother. Stacy Castor was arrested at the hospital. She was charged with second-degree murder in the death of David Castor, attempted murder of Ashley Wallace, and forgery of David Castor's will. She was not charged with the death of Michael Wallace because investigators in Cayuga County determined they did not have sufficient evidence for a separate prosecution. His death remained classified as a homicide, but Stacy was never tried for it. Her trial opened in January 2009 in Onondaga County Court before Judge Fahey. The prosecution was led by District Attorney William Fitzpatrick and Chief Assistant District Attorney Christine Garvey. The case against her was built around 4 interlocking pieces: the physical evidence from the David Castor scene, the exhumation results from Michael Wallace, the attempted poisoning of Ashley, and the forged suicide note. Ashley Wallace testified first. She described the 2 evenings she had spent drinking with her mother in the days after she learned her father had been poisoned. She said the drink tasted wrong. She said she woke up in a hospital with no memory of how she had gotten there. She said she did not write the note found in her room and did not recognize the signature at the bottom as something she had done. Her younger sister Bree testified about finding Ashley unresponsive and finding the note. Both daughters were composed on the stand. Both said they had not believed their mother was capable of this until the evidence was laid in front of them. An investigator named Detective Dominic Spinelli testified about a detail that became central to the prosecution's case. During an earlier interrogation, Stacy Castor had referred to antifreeze not as antifreeze, but as anti-free, cutting off the word before the last syllable. Spinelli noted this during the interrogation and kept it. When forensic examiners analysed the typed suicide note, they found that the word antifreeze was misspelled in 4 separate places within the document, each time rendered as anti-free. The prosecution's position was that the same person who said anti-free in the interrogation had typed anti-free in the suicide note, and that person was not Ashley Wallace. Prosecutors also presented evidence about how ethylene glycol poisoning works. The substance is sweet and largely odourless, which makes it possible to administer in a drink without the person immediately detecting it. Toxicity builds over time. David Castor's deterioration across the Labor Day weekend was consistent with progressive poisoning rather than a single large dose. The turkey baster in the kitchen trash, bearing his DNA and the substance that killed him, suggested he had been administered it while he could not resist, or perhaps while he was sleeping. His lack of fingerprints on the glass beside his body suggested someone else had placed it there after he was already past the point of being able to hold it. Stacy Castor took the stand in her own defence. She maintained her innocence across all counts. She denied poisoning David, denied poisoning Ashley, denied writing or typing the suicide note. She said the 3 months she and David had spent watching news coverage of the Lynn Turner case had given David the idea of taking his own life with the same substance. She said she had no idea why her fingerprints were on the glass and David's were not. She said Ashley's overdose was something she could not explain. When the prosecutor pressed her on the forged will, she said she had not altered anything. The defence attempted to argue that Ashley Wallace had in fact murdered both men herself, and that the suicide attempt was real. Defence attorney Charles Keller suggested that Ashley, who was 12 when her father died, had killed Michael Wallace because he gave severe physical punishments and favoured her younger sister. He argued she had then killed David Castor out of resentment. Keller told the jury that guilt and fear of her mother's arrest had driven Ashley to the overdose and the note. Ashley Wallace had already testified that she did not do any of it. The jury of 10 women and 2 men took 16 hours across 4 days to deliberate. On February 5, 2009, they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. Second-degree murder for the death of David Castor. Attempted second-degree murder for the poisoning of Ashley Wallace. Stacy Castor sat with her eyes closed as the verdicts were read. There was a gasp from the front row of the gallery where Ashley and Bree sat with members of both families. The families held each other. At sentencing on March 5, 2009, Judge Fahy imposed the maximum on each count, 25 years to life for the murder of David Castor, another 25 years to life for the attempted murder of Ashley Wallace, and an additional 1 1/3 to 4 years for the forgery of David's will. The sentences ran consecutively. District Attorney Fitzpatrick told reporters that Stacy would have to serve a minimum of 51 1/3 years before any parole eligibility, and that given her age, she would very likely die in prison. Judge Fahy said from the bench that in 34 years in the criminal justice system, having seen serial killers and contract killers and killers of every variety and stripe, he had never encountered a parent willing to sacrifice their own child to shift the blame away from themselves. He sentenced her to the maximum available under New York law. She maintained her innocence from the day of her arrest through the last day of her life. She appealed the conviction on multiple grounds, including the inclusion of evidence related to Michael Wallace's death, for which she had never been charged. The appeals courts rejected those arguments. On June 11, 2016, Stacy Castor was found dead in her cell at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in Westchester County, New York, the same maximum security prison where Pamela Smart was also held. She was 48 years old, a heart attack. No foul play was suspected. Michael Wallace was 38 years old. David Castor was 48. Ashley Wallace was 20 when her mother poured whatever was in that drink and sat with her while she swallowed it. She told Judge Fahy at sentencing that she hated her mother for ruining so many people's lives. She was the one who had to say it out loud in open court, with her mother sitting 10 feet away, because both of the men who should have been there to say it first were already gone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cases so far have shared a patient, methodical quality, a plan executed over time. What comes next is different. Carrie Jones did not act alone and did not take months to plan. She told her husband what she wanted, and he went and did it, and 4 people who had nothing to do with their marriage did not survive the night. Case 3. Carrie Jones. Laurel, Nebraska is a town of fewer than 1,000 people in the northeast corner of the state. Cedar County is the kind of place where people know not only their neighbors, but their neighbors' schedules, their cars, their habits, the names of their children and grandchildren. On Elm Street in Laurel, families had lived beside each other for decades. The Twiffords had moved into 503 Elm Street in 2014 after spending nearly 50 years raising 4 children on a farm outside of town. Gene Twifford was 86 years old. His wife Janet was 85. Their daughter Dana, 55, lived with them. 2 blocks away at 209 Elm, Michelle Eberling, 53, lived with her fiancé Brian Welch. These were not strangers to each other or to anyone else on that street. They were the texture of the place. In the early morning hours of August 4th, 2022, that changed permanently. At approximately 3:02 a.m., a motion sensor on the Twifford home's security system registered movement. At 3:04, a clock inside the house stopped. The fire had started by then. At 3:11, the first 911 call came in from a neighbour who had seen an orange glow and heard what sounded like an explosion at Michelle Eberling's house on the same street. First responders arrived to find Eberling's home burning. She was pulled unresponsive from inside. She had been shot. A red 5-gallon gas can was found in the living room with paw marks across the carpet. The fire marshal later determined the blaze was incendiary, set deliberately with an ignitable liquid released through the structure before ignition. Around 9:30 that morning, investigators working the Eberling scene noticed smoke rising from the Twifford house 2 blocks away. Several headed there before firefighters did. A state fire marshal investigator reached the back of the Twifford home and found the storm door open, the interior door unlocked, the door jamb plate on the outdoor mat, a pry bar on the ground nearby, splintered wood on the frame. He went in. The investigator who followed him described the interior as feeling like walking into an oven. Gene Twifford was on the bedroom floor. He had been shot to death. Janet Twifford was also inside, shot multiple times. Dana Twifford was there as well. All 3 had been shot. The house was burning around them. 4 people were gone before sunrise. Jason Jones, 44 years old, was arrested the following morning at the couple's home at 206 Elm Street, the same street 2 blocks from one scene and 2 blocks from the other. Nebraska State Patrol SWAT officers entered and found him with severe burns covering much of his body, injuries consistent with setting the fires and being caught by the ignition. He was carried out and taken to a hospital in Lincoln, where he remained for several weeks before being transferred to the state correctional system. 2 firearms and 3 handgun cases were recovered in his bedroom. Forensic analysis confirmed that a .44 Magnum Desert Eagle found in his possession had fired the rounds recovered from Michelle Eberling's body and her home. A Ruger 57 was recovered from the floor of the Twifford home. Receipts traced to Jason Jones linked him to the purchase of fuel used in both fires. Gas cans matched between the 2 scenes. The question of why took longer to answer than the question of who. Carrie Jones, 43, was Jason's wife. They lived together at 206 Elm. She was known around Laurel as a difficult presence. Court filings would later note that other residents had sought protection orders against her over her behaviour in the community. A motion filed by her defence attorneys ahead of her own trial raised concerns that prosecutors might introduce evidence related to texts and recorded phone conversations involving references to witchcraft, voodoo, and the occult. The community had a complicated relationship with Carrie Jones before August 4, 2022, and the murders did nothing to simplify it. She also collected dolls. Investigators found 10 to 15 of them in the Jones home. When they searched Jason's semi-truck, a large doll was found buckled into the passenger seat. And inside Michelle Eberling's home, on the kitchen table, there was a doll that Eberling's fiancé said did not belong to her. The motive prosecutors developed over the months following the murders centered on Gene Twifford. Carrie Jones told investigators that Twifford had been verbally harassing her with sexual and inappropriate comments for 2 to 3 years. She said she had confronted him and it had not stopped. Other residents confirmed that Twyford had a reputation as a jokester who made comments to women that crossed lines. The Laurel police chief testified that he had received 4 or 5 complaints over recent years from other people, including the manager of a local convenience store, about Twyford making inappropriate remarks to female employees. He had spoken to Twyford about it. Twyford, by the chief's account, seemed genuinely puzzled by the upset. Investigators recovered a series of text messages exchanged between Carrie and Jason Jones in March and April 2022, months before the murders. In those messages, Carrie directed Jason to track down Jean Twyford at various locations around Laurel. Analysis of Jason's phone showed travel patterns consistent with him driving around town looking for Twyford at those times. In one message, Carrie suggested she should undergo sniper training in order to shoot Jean Twyford with a rifle. Those messages had been deleted from Carrie's phone by the time investigators found them on Jason's. Carrie Jones later told a State Patrol investigator that she had threatened her husband with a gun and a knife if he did not do something to make the harassment stop. She said she had not told him to take anyone's life, but acknowledged saying she would take matters into her own hands if he did not act. The prosecutor at her trial put the question directly to the jury: does this crime happen at all without her? In the hours after the fires were reported, Laurel Police Chief Ron Lundahl spoke to Carrie Jones on her porch. She told him she had seen an orange glow at the Ebeling house, walked to the edge of the property, saw the flames, and ran back to her own home. What Lundahl did not know at that moment was that Jason Jones was inside their house at 206 Elm, suffering from the burns he had received during the fires, receiving no medical attention. When a State Patrol officer called Carrie on the phone while she was driving back to Laurel and asked her to get Jason to answer his phone, she said into the recorded line that he would not answer, he would not come to the door, and he was not going to be able to respond to anyone. She said, in that recorded call, that he was burned up. She knew where he was. She knew what he had done. She hid him, tended to whatever she could, kept his weapons in the house, and told investigators as little as possible for as long as possible. After he was arrested and hospitalized, she disposed of the clothing he had been wearing during the crimes. When investigators asked to search Jason's semi-truck, she unlocked it for them herself, a gesture that fit a pattern of performing cooperation while withholding what mattered. Her statements to law enforcement evolved and shifted over the 4 months between his arrest and her own, with investigators noting multiple points at which her account changed in content, tone, and detail. She was arrested on December 16, 2022, 4 months after the murders. She was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Jean Twyford, evidence tampering, and being an accessory to a felony in connection with all 4 killings. Her trial was moved from Cedar County to Madison County to allow for an impartial jury. It opened on July 28, 2025. Assistant Nebraska Attorney General Sandra Allen told jurors in her opening statement that even if the evidence showed Carrie Jones had not pulled the trigger the night Jean Twyford died, she had pulled the strings that led to his death. Nebraska law, Allen reminded the jury, holds that commanding a murder carries the same legal weight as committing it. The prosecution built its case around the text messages, the recorded phone calls, the testimony of law enforcement officers who had watched her account shift across multiple interviews, and the physical evidence linking Jason Jones directly to all 4 crime scenes. The defense argued that the evidence did not establish that the murders took place at Carrie's direction, and that whatever messages had passed between the couple did not rise to the level of a murder command. Jason Jones was listed by the defense as a potential witness, but did not appear. On August 7, 2025, the jury found Carrie Jones guilty on all 3 counts: first-degree murder, evidence tampering, and accessory to a felony. On November 20, 2025, Cedar County District Judge Brian Meismer sentenced her to life in prison without parole on the murder count, with additional consecutive sentences of 5 to 10 years for evidence tampering and 16 to 20 years for the accessory charge. In that same courthouse, on that same day, a 3-judge panel convened separately to consider whether her husband Jason Jones should receive the death penalty for carrying out the 4 killings. Jean Twyford was 86 years old. Janet Twyford was 85. Their daughter Dana was 55. Michelle Ebeling was 53, and she and her fiancé had been planning a life together. The Twyford and Ebeling homes on Elm Street have since been demolished. The lots where those houses stood are empty now. Gail Curry, the surviving daughter of Jean and Janet and sister of Dana, said after the sentencing that their love lives on through the family. Their mother, she said, always used to say, "All our love, always." Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves from a small Nebraska street to a New Jersey fertility clinic, and from a husband told to act to a husband who never saw it coming at all. Case 4. Melanie Maguire. On May 5, 2004, 2 fishermen and 2 children spotted something in the water near the 4th artificial island of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel in Virginia. It was a suitcase, dark green, floating on the surface. They called it in. Inside was the lower half of a human body. 6 days later, on May 11th, a second suitcase surfaced in the same stretch of water. Inside was a torso. On May 16th, a third suitcase was recovered near the second artificial island, containing the arms. The medical examiner in Virginia found 2.38 caliber bullets in the remains, 1 entrance and exit wound to the head, and a second wound to the chest. The 3 suitcases were a matching set. William Maguire, 39 years old, a computer programmer who had spent the last 5 years of his life in Woodbridge, New Jersey, with his wife and their 2 small sons, had been shot, dismembered, drained of blood, wrapped in industrial garbage bags sealed with adhesive tape, and distributed across 3 pieces of luggage that had then been driven to Virginia and thrown from a bridge in the dark. 4 weeks passed before Virginia Beach police identified him from a facial reconstruction sketch that an acquaintance recognized. The investigation then transferred to the New Jersey State Police. Bill Maguire was born September 21, 1964, and had served in the United States Navy before becoming a computer programmer for a college in Newark. He and Melanie married in 1999. She was a nurse at a fertility clinic called RMA Associates in Morristown, and they lived in a Woodbridge apartment with their 2 boys, who were young enough to still be in daycare. By April 2004, the marriage was in a state that only Melanie fully understood. Bill, by the accounts of friends who spoke to investigators, was happy. He was excited. On April 28, 2004, the couple closed on the purchase of the first home they had ever owned together. He called the gas company at 5:37 that afternoon to transfer their account. At 5:44 and again at 5:59, he called 2 friends to tell them happily that it was done, that they had bought the house. Those were among the last phone calls Bill Maguire ever made. Melanie did not want the house. She did not want the marriage. She had been having an affair for some time with Dr. Bradley Miller, a partner at the fertility clinic where she worked. The 2 had discussed leaving their spouses to be together. What Melanie had not yet resolved was the practical question of how to exit the marriage without losing custody of her children and without the financial exposure that a divorce would bring. In April 2004, she began solving that problem a different way. Investigators later recovered internet searches from her computer, including queries on how to purchase a firearm illegally, how to commit a murder, and what poisons and sedative drugs were undetectable. She had also asked a friend directly how to buy a gun off the books. On April 26, 2004, 2 days before the house closing, she drove to a gun store in Easton, Pennsylvania, and purchased a .38 caliber revolver over the counter. The receipt also listed a $9.95 purchase. The store stocked only 2 items at that price. One of them was a box of wad cutter cartridges, the type later recovered from Bill's body. That same morning, April 28th, a prescription for chloral hydrate was filled at a Walgreens pharmacy near the daycare where Melanie dropped her boys off each morning. Chloral hydrate is a powerful and rarely prescribed liquid sedative. The prescription had been written on the pad of Dr. Miller, whose pad Melanie had access to through her work at the clinic. The name on the prescription matched a fertility clinic patient who had not requested it. Melanie picked up the boys from daycare that evening. The couple came home from the house closing. The last record of Bill Maguire being alive was his phone calls to friends at 5:44 and 5:59 that afternoon. Prosecutors argued that Melanie administered the chloral hydrate to Bill that evening, likely in a drink, and then shot him with the .38 caliber revolver sometime on the night of April 28th or the early hours of April 29th. Over the following days, she dismembered his body using a reciprocating saw and a knife, wrapped the sections in industrial garbage bags, sealed them with adhesive tape, and packed them into the matching three-piece Kenneth Cole suitcase set the couple owned. She told investigators later that she and Bill did not own matching luggage, then the following day revised that account and said she remembered a set and identified a photograph of the suitcases as resembling theirs. On May 3rd, she drove to Virginia. The suitcases went off the bridge at night. Bill's Nissan Maxima was found on June 4th, 2004, at a tow yard in Atlantic City. On the passenger seat were his cell phone and hotel pamphlets for Atlantic City and Virginia Beach. Inside the glove compartment was a syringe similar to ones used at the Morristown Clinic and a prescription bottle of chloral hydrate in the name of the clinic patient whose prescription Melanie had forged. The defense would later argue that Bill had packed the suitcases himself on the night of his disappearance and driven to Atlantic City. The Virginia detective who examined the car testified that the 3 suitcases would not have fit in the Maxima's trunk and that 2 child seats occupied the back seat. Inside the suitcases, forensic examiners found a hospital blanket with the initials HCSC, a company that supplied medical linens to approximately 100 hospitals and clinics in New Jersey. The RMA Associates Fertility Clinic in Morristown, where Melanie worked, had been receiving approximately 100 such blankets per week from that company since 2001. A 10-inch hair found in one of the suitcases matched Melanie's DNA profile. Garbage bags from the Maguire's apartment were tested and found to be consistent with the bags used to wrap the body sections, coming from the same production run. The adhesive tape used to seal the bags also matched tape found in the apartment. After the investigation transferred to New Jersey, law enforcement placed Melanie under surveillance and began building the evidentiary file. In June 2005, 14 months after Bill disappeared, she was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. She was released on bail. In the months between her arrest and her trial, anonymous communications were sent to law enforcement, directing investigators toward other possible suspects, including suggestions that Bill had been killed by Atlantic City organized crime figures connected to his alleged gambling debts. A jailhouse informant came forward with a story supporting that theory. Investigators established the informant was entirely unreliable and habitually fabricated accounts. He recanted, and the theory collapsed before trial began. Her trial opened on March 5, 2007, at the Middlesex County Courthouse in New Brunswick, before Judge Frederick DeVessa. The prosecution was led by Assistant State Attorney General Patricia Prezioso. The case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. No blood was found in the Woodbridge apartment, despite multiple searches. No murder weapon was ever recovered. The .38 caliber revolver Melanie purchased in Pennsylvania was never located. Prosecutors acknowledged these gaps directly, but argued the totality of the circumstantial evidence, the internet searches, the forged prescription, the gun purchase receipt, the matching luggage, the blanket, the garbage bags, the tape, the hair, the gun caliber, the sedative in the glove compartment, the timeline of phone calls on April 28th, built a case that admitted no reasonable alternative explanation. Defense attorney Joseph Tacopina argued that Melanie, described in court as petite, could not physically have overpowered Bill, who stood 6 feet 3 inches and weighed 210 pounds, and could not have dismembered a body of that size alone in an apartment with neighbouring units on all sides. He pointed to the absence of physical evidence in the apartment as confirmation that the crime had not happened there. He suggested Bill had been killed elsewhere by people connected to his gambling debts. Secretly recorded conversations between Melanie and Dr. Miller, played for the jury, showed her repeatedly denying any involvement in her husband's death. They also showed her asking Miller to help her establish that Bill had last been seen in Atlantic City, and discussing what story they could maintain. On April 23, 2007, after deliberating, the jury found Melanie Maguire guilty of first-degree murder, desecration of human remains, perjury for testimony she had given to obtain a restraining order against Bill during the period after his disappearance, and unlawful possession of a firearm. The jury acquitted her on several additional counts tied to the anonymous communications sent to law enforcement after her arrest. On July 19, 2007, Judge DeVessa sentenced her to life in prison, plus 5 years, with a minimum of 66 years to be served before any parole eligibility. Under the sentence as imposed, Melanie Maguire will not be eligible for parole until May 2073, when she would be 100 years old. Then Attorney General Stuart Rabner said after the verdict that Melanie Maguire had gone to extraordinary lengths to cover up what she had done, and that the state had gone to equally extraordinary lengths to expose and convict her. She has maintained her innocence from the day of her arrest through today. Every appeal and every post-conviction relief petition has failed. She is currently incarcerated at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility in Clinton Township, New Jersey, listed in the state corrections system under her maiden name, Melanie Slate. Bill Maguire made 2 phone calls on the evening of April 28, 2004, to tell friends he had finally bought a house. His 2 sons were toddlers. The house the family closed on that afternoon was never moved into. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Melanie Maguire spent days dismembering a body in secret and months feeding investigators false leads before anyone charged her with anything. The next case is different in almost every way. The cover-up lasted years, the killing was done by proxy, and the woman at the centre of it sat at her husband's bedside every day while he slowly died from what she had arranged. Case 5. Celeste Beard. In the early morning hours of October 2, 1999, a woman crept into the master bedroom of a home in the Westlake Hills neighborhood of Austin, Texas, and shot the man sleeping in the bed with a 20-gauge shotgun. The shot caught him in the stomach. She fled. The man, somehow conscious, reached for the phone and called 911 himself. He told the operator that his guts had jumped out of his stomach, that they were lying on top of him, that he did not know what had happened and had never had anything like this happen before. The first officer who responded got no answer at the door and no response to knocking, looked through a window, saw the man on the bed, and broke through a sliding glass door to get inside. By then, from another wing of the large house, Celeste Beard and one of her daughters had emerged. Celeste told investigators she had been asleep when the shooting occurred and had heard nothing. The man in the bed was Stephen Beard. He was 73 years old, a retired Fox Broadcasting executive who had built a net worth of approximately $12 million over a career in television. He had met Celeste in 1993 at the Austin Country Club, where she was working as a waitress and he was a member. His wife of 42 years had died of cancer that same year, and Stephen was a widower. Celeste was 30, had been married 3 times before, and had 13-year-old twin daughters named Christina and Jennifer from one of those earlier marriages. She and Stephen married in February 1995. He was 70 at the time. She was 32. He adopted her daughters. He commissioned a custom home for the family in an expensive subdivision and gave Celeste a monthly household budget of $35,000. She spent considerably more than that. By the late 1990s, the marriage was under pressure from multiple directions. Stephen's banker had informed him that Celeste had been removing his late wife's silver and jewellery from a safety deposit box without his knowledge. Stephen filed for divorce. They reconciled and he withdrew the petition, but the underlying issues did not resolve. Celeste continued to spend. According to Stephen's accountant, she spent $321,000 in October and November of 1999 alone, an additional $249,000 by December 10th, and another $100,000 in the 6 weeks ending March 31st, 2000. Those figures cover the months after he was shot. In the 6 months following the shooting, the accountant tracked $670,000 in spending. She was still going through his money from a hospital waiting room. In early 1999, before the shooting, Celeste had checked herself into St. David's Pavilion, a psychiatric facility in Austin, for treatment of depression. Her daughters described a household in which Celeste's moods had become unpredictable and frightening. On at least one occasion, they had seen her holding a gun to her own head during an argument with Stephen. At St. David's, she met another patient, Tracy Tarleton, who managed Austin's largest independent bookstore and was openly gay. The two women formed a close bond during their time at the facility and continued to spend time together after both were discharged that summer. Tarleton's co-workers noticed the relationship. So did Celeste's daughters. So eventually did Stephen. At a barbecue gathering, Stephen reportedly witnessed Tarleton attempting to kiss Celeste and ordered her to leave. He began demanding that Tarleton stop calling the house. Tarleton later described the relationship as a romantic one, saying she loved Celeste and believed Celeste loved her. Celeste consistently denied any romantic dimension, saying they were simply close friends and that Tarleton had misread the nature of their relationship. What both women agreed on was that they were in frequent contact through the summer and fall of 1999. What they disagreed on for years was what had been discussed during those conversations. On the morning of October 2nd, 1999, the day before Stephen and Celeste were scheduled to leave on an extended trip to Europe together, Tracy Tarleton walked into the Beard home while Stephen was asleep and shot him in the stomach. A spent 20-gauge shotgun shell was found near the bed. Acting on information from nearly everyone around Celeste who investigators spoke to, police identified Tarleton within days and arrested her on October 8th, 5 days after the shooting, while Stephen was still in hospital. The shotgun recovered from her possession matched the shell at the scene. She admitted she had fired the shot. She did not explain why. She would not, at that stage, say a word about Celeste. Stephen Beard survived the initial surgery. He spent 3 months in hospital, and on January 18, 2000, he was discharged into Celeste's care and returned home. 1 day later, he was back in hospital with a severe infection stemming from his wounds. On January 22, 2000, a blood clot directly linked to the shotgun wound killed him. The charge against Tarleton was upgraded to murder. Throughout Stephen's hospitalization, Celeste worked to keep investigators away from him. When police came to speak with him in the intensive care unit in the days after the shooting, Stephen became visibly agitated when officers mentioned Tarleton's name, though he could not speak due to tubes in his mouth and throat. When investigators returned a second time, they found that Celeste had posted a notice on the door of his room: "No visitors, including police." Security guards enforced the instruction. Stephen Beard died without investigators ever speaking to him again. The family's attorney confirmed that Celeste had directed all access to be restricted during his hospitalization. The question of what Stephen might have told investigators if he had been permitted to speak has never been answered. After his death, Celeste moved quickly. Within 6 months, she had married for the 5th time. She had continued spending from Stephen's estate at the pace she had established before his death. The formal charge against Tarleton stood at murder, and Tarleton had continued to say nothing about Celeste for more than a year after her arrest. Then Tarleton read a newspaper clipping in her jail cell about Celeste's 5th marriage and concluded that everything she had believed about their relationship was false. In March 2002, shortly before her own murder trial was to begin, Tarleton reached a plea agreement with prosecutors. In exchange for a 20-year sentence, she agreed to testify fully about what had led to Stephen Beard's death. Tarleton's account was detailed and specific. She said that during the months they spent together after leaving St. David's, Celeste had repeatedly told her that the only way the two of them could truly be together was if Stephen was gone. She said Celeste had described Stephen as emotionally abusive and had told Tarleton that she feared being driven to suicide if the marriage continued. Tarleton said she had come to believe that shooting Stephen was the only way to free Celeste and make their future together possible. She said Celeste had given her specific instructions about how to carry it out. Based on Tarleton's statement, Celeste was arrested on March 28, 2002 and charged with capital murder and conspiracy to commit murder. At trial, prosecutors argued that she had married Stephen Beard for financial security and had orchestrated his death because he was threatening divorce over her spending and because she wanted to be with Tarleton while retaining access to his estate. The prosecution introduced spending records, estate documents, and evidence that the couple's combined therapy sessions had been addressing Celeste's out-of-control expenditures in the months before the shooting. They also introduced a taped phone call in which Celeste could be heard discussing a plan to have someone kill Tarleton, evidence that Celeste herself was capable of arranging violence when she believed someone posed a threat to her. The defense, led by attorney Dick DeGuerin, argued that Tarleton was an unstable, unreliable witness who had acted entirely on her own out of obsessive attachment to Celeste. Defense psychiatric experts testified that Tarleton had been clinically depressed and suicidal in 1998 and 1999, that she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and that she had harboured a delusional belief that Stephen Beard was preventing her relationship with Celeste. De Guerin told the jury that Tarleton's testimony was the product of a plea deal that had given her strong incentive to fabricate a more detailed story than the one she had told for more than a year after her arrest. He also suggested that Celeste's daughters had testified against their mother because they stood to inherit Stephen's estate only if Celeste was convicted, and noted that during her testimony, Christina answered, "I do not remember," to defense questions 298 times. Celeste's twin daughters, both adopted by Stephen Beard, testified for the prosecution. They described what they had seen and heard inside the Beard household in the years leading up to the shooting, including their mother's erratic behaviour, her relationship with Tarleton, and things Celeste had said about Stephen during that period. On January 15, 2003, the jury convicted Celeste Beard of capital murder under the Texas law of parties, which holds that a person who solicits or commands a murder is equally responsible as the person who carries it out. Prosecutors had not sought the death penalty, and the conviction carried a mandatory life sentence. The sentencing hearing gave Stephen Beard's family a chance to speak. His son, Stephen Beard III, told Celeste he hoped she burned in hell. Her daughter Christina, speaking to the woman who had raised her, said that Stephen had let Celeste into his home, had loved and honoured her, and that she had violated and murdered him. She told her mother to be ashamed. Celeste was denied the inheritance she had expected. Stephen's estate passed to his blood children and to Christina and Jennifer, his adopted daughters. The money Stephen Beard had accumulated over a life's work went to his family, and to the daughters Celeste had given him, not to Celeste. Tracy Tarleton served 10 years of her 20-year sentence and was paroled in 2011. She moved to San Antonio. As of 2021, she had been taken off parole supervision. Celeste Beard is currently incarcerated at the Christina Melton Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas. She will be eligible for parole on April 1st, 2042, when she will be 79 years old. She has maintained her innocence in every interview and every legal filing since her arrest. Stephen Beard was 73 years old. He had been widowed, found someone he believed in, adopted her children, and commissioned a house for a family he wanted to give everything to. He never spoke to investigators after the morning he was shot. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Celeste Beard arranged a shooting and then sat at her husband's bedside for months, controlling who could enter his room, while he died slowly from the wound she had commissioned. The next case involves a wife who skipped the waiting altogether. She handed someone a camera, walked into a police station, and tried to turn the whole thing into a television segment. Case 6. Dalia Dippolito. On the morning of August 5, 2009, Dalia Dippolito pulled up to the townhouse she shared with her husband Michael in Boynton Beach, Florida, and found police tape across the front. Officers were stationed outside. A scene had been established. She got out of her car and a uniformed officer approached her. He told her there had been an incident. He told her that her husband was dead. She began to cry. She began to wail. She dropped. The reaction was captured on video by a camera crew from the television show Cops, which had been riding along with the Boynton Beach Police Department that week. The footage of Dalia Dippolito collapsing in apparent grief on the pavement outside her home would later be seen by millions of people. Her husband was inside the house, alive, having been quietly removed before she arrived. The crime scene was staged. The whole thing was a setup, and she had asked for it 4 days earlier. Dalia Muhammad was born in 1981 and grew up in South Florida. By her mid-20s, she was working as an escort. In late 2008, she met Michael Dippolito through that work. He had hired her. He was 37, a former conman who had pleaded guilty in 2003 to fraud charges involving the theft of investor funds and had been sentenced to 2 years in prison, followed by 28 years of probation. When he met Dalia, he was still on that probation. which restricted his finances and his movements in ways he had been quietly working around. He fell for her quickly. He was still married to another woman at the time. He divorced his wife, and 5 days after the divorce was finalized, he and Dalia were married. The date was February 2009. They had known each other for approximately 4 months. Within weeks of the wedding, according to testimony Michael later gave at trial, things began to go wrong in ways that he did not immediately recognize as deliberate. Approximately $100,000 disappeared from accounts he controlled. He believed at first it was a mistake or a misunderstanding. He also found, on 2 separate occasions, that drugs had been planted in his vehicle. Both times police were called. Both times he could have been found in violation of his probation and returned to prison. The drugs were found, and the matter did not escalate into a revocation. But the pattern did not look like coincidence in hindsight. Michael also testified that on at least one occasion, he believed she had put something in his iced tea, and that testing later suggested antifreeze had been present in the drink. He survived without apparent injury. What Dalia was doing in parallel to the marriage, in the months between the February wedding and the August that followed, was working through a set of contingency plans. She was in contact with a former lover named Mohammed Shihadeh. She was also exchanging explicit text messages with a separate man named Mike Stanley, who she recruited to play roles in a scheme to isolate and ultimately destroy her husband's financial and legal standing. Stanley, at Dalia's direction, impersonated a doctor and told Michael that Dalia was pregnant, which she was not. This was done, prosecutors argued, to conceal the $100,000 theft by giving Michael a reason to believe money was going toward medical expenses. Stanley also impersonated an attorney and told Michael that his probation had been formally completed, which it had not. The goal was to get Michael to stop reporting to his probation officer, which would trigger a violation and send him back to prison. When neither the fraud exposure nor the probation revocation removed Michael from the picture, Dalia arrived at a more direct approach. In July 2009, she contacted Shihadeh and asked him to find her someone who could kill her husband. Shihadeh went to the Boynton Beach Police Department on July 31st, 2009. He told them what Dalia had asked him to arrange. Police immediately opened an investigation and deployed an undercover officer named Whitey Jean to pose as a contract killer available for hire. Jean made contact with Dalia through Shihadeh. On August 1st, 2009, 4 days before the staged scene at the townhouse, Dalia met undercover officer Jean in the parking lot of a CVS store in Boynton Beach. The cops' camera crew was not present for this meeting. The conversation was recorded by concealed police equipment. Jean discussed logistics. He asked how certain she was that she wanted this done. She told him there was no changing her mind. She said she was determined already, positive, 5,000% sure. She agreed to a payment of $7,000 and provided specific details about when Michael would be home alone and how the approach should be handled. The conversation was explicit, practical, and without hesitation on her part. 4 days later, police staged the fake murder scene at the townhouse, removed Michael beforehand, and filmed Dalia's reaction as she arrived home and was told her husband had been killed. After the footage of her apparent grief was recorded, officers escorted her to the police station under the cover story that they needed her to help identify possible suspects in the killing. Once she was in an interrogation room, they told her the truth. Her husband was alive. The hitman was an undercover detective. She had been recorded at the CVS. She was under arrest for solicitation of first-degree murder. The case became nationally known within hours. The cops' footage and the CVS recording were released by the Boynton Beach Police Department in November 2009 and spread rapidly. The footage of Dalia crying at the staged crime scene, followed by the CVS recording of her calmly arranging the logistics of her husband's death 4 days earlier, produced a striking contrast. Her first trial began in 2011. The jury convicted her of solicitation to commit first-degree murder. The judge, describing the plot as pure evil, sentenced her to 20 years in prison. The conviction did not hold. In 2014, a Florida appellate court found that the jury selection process had been improperly handled, given the volume of pre-trial publicity the case had received, and ordered a new trial. The second trial, in 2016, ended with a hung jury, 3-3, without a verdict. A third trial was scheduled. Between trials, Dalia had been released on house arrest and gave media interviews in which the defense position shifted significantly. At her first trial, her attorneys had argued that the entire scheme was a fabrication she and Michael had created together in hopes of getting on reality television, that the two of them had wanted to be filmed by a real police department doing a real-looking murder-for-hire sting, and that the cameras were the point of the whole exercise. Michael denied this on the stand at each trial and called it false. At her second and third trials, the defense dropped the reality television argument entirely and redirected its attack at the Boynton Beach Police Department, arguing that the department had staged the fake crime scene and manipulated the investigation in order to generate dramatic footage for the cops' broadcast, that the investigation had been conducted for television rather than for law enforcement purposes, and that the integrity of the sting had been compromised by the presence of the cameras. A former Boynton Beach detective named Frank Ramsey, who had worked on the case, testified for the defense at the later trials that he had opposed having cops film the investigation because cameras alter the behaviour of everyone present, including officers. He said that his supervisors had refused to delay a key recorded meeting between Dalia and Shahade, even after Shahade's recording device failed, which left a gap in the evidentiary record that Ramsey said should not have been acceptable. The defense used this testimony to argue that the investigation had been shaped by the desire for good television rather than good evidence. The third trial began in June 2017. Prosecutors returned to the approach that had worked in 2011. They played the CVS recording. They played the footage of her reaction at the staged crime scene. They called Michael Dippolito to testify about the stolen $100,000, the planted drugs, the tampered drink, and the months of manipulation that preceded the murder-for-hire conversation at the CVS. They also introduced the explicit text messages Dalia had exchanged with Mike Stanley, which showed the detailed and calculated nature of the effort she had made to remove her husband from her life through multiple methods before arriving at the one recorded in the parking lot. The six-person jury deliberated for approximately 90 minutes and returned a guilty verdict on the charge of solicitation to commit first-degree murder. Dalia showed no visible reaction when the verdict was read. On July 21, 2017, Circuit Judge Glenn Kelly sentenced her to 16 years in Florida State Prison. He said she had acted in a cold and calculated manner, that a plan had been put in place by her to end her husband's life, and that the plan had been sophisticated and deliberate. The prosecutor described her at sentencing as a master manipulator and told the court that she would do whatever it took to get what she wanted. Michael, who had now spent 9 years dealing with 3 trials arising from a marriage that lasted less than a year, issued a statement saying he was 5,000% happy with the verdict. The Florida 4th District Court of Appeal rejected her subsequent appeal in 2019, ruling that the involvement of the cops' camera crew had not constituted a due process violation because the television show had only been present at the arrest, by which point the crime of solicitation had already been fully completed. The Florida Supreme Court later rejected her appeal without comment. Every legal avenue she had pursued since her 2009 arrest had closed. Dalia Dippolito is currently incarcerated at the Lowell Correctional Institution in Marion County, Florida. Her scheduled release date is 2032. Michael Dippolito, who was told by an officer on a Florida sidewalk that his wife had paid someone $7,000 to shoot him, has said in interviews that he cannot fully process the fact that he is alive because of a police tip from a man his wife had asked to help arrange his death. They had been married for 6 months when she sat in the CVS parking lot and confirmed, without pause, that she was 5,000% sure. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Dalia Dippolito was caught on camera before the plan was carried out. The next wife was not caught for years, and by the time she was, she had already stabbed her husband 193 times, buried him in the backyard, and told her children he had gone on a trip. Case 7. Susan Wright. On January 18, 2003, officers from the Harris County Precinct 4 Constable's Office arrived at a patio home in the White Oak Bend subdivision of Northwest Houston, Texas, following a call from an attorney named Neil Davis. Davis told them he represented a client that he was bound by attorney-client privilege and could not give details, but that he had reason to believe a body could be found at this address. When officers arrived, they walked to the backyard. There, next to a concrete patio, was a shallow hole in the ground. The family dog had been at it. A portion of what was inside was already partially exposed. Officers found the nude body of Jeffrey Wright, 34 years old, a carpet and flooring salesman from northwest Houston. His hands had been wrapped. His body was partially covered with towels. The mattress from the master bedroom, along with the box spring, the comforter, and the headboard, had all been dragged into the backyard and left beside the hole. The mattress was soaked through with blood. Inside the house, the master bedroom told the rest of the story. One wall had been freshly painted, so recently the paint was not fully dry. A section of carpet had been cut out of the floor with a box cutter. Blood had dried in spatters on the curtains and on other surfaces in the room that the bleach and the fresh paint had not reached. Investigators found a receipt for 2 gallons of bleach, a pair of size 6 jeans with bleach staining on them, and a towel. Painting supplies, a box cutter, and scissors were collected as evidence. Inside a flower pot in the bedroom, they found the tip of a knife blade, broken off during the assault with enough force that it had embedded in the victim's skull. Jeff Wright had been stabbed 193 times. The medical examiner catalogued the wounds: 41 to the face, 23 to the neck, 46 to the chest, 22 to the arms, and additional wounds distributed across his back, abdomen, and the rest of his body, including 7 in the pubic region. The knife tip in his skull corresponded to one of 2 knives used during the attack. The number and distribution of the wounds indicated a sustained and frenzied assault rather than a single reactive episode. Some wounds were shallow, others were deep and fatal. There were marks on his wrists consistent with having been tied during the initial portion of the attack. The medical examiner concluded he had likely managed to free at least one limb before he died. Red candle wax was found on his legs and around his groin area. Investigators noted pre-mortem markings on the victim that the lead prosecutor, Kelly Siegler, would later characterize as signs of what had happened in that room before the knives came out. Susan Lucille Wright was 26 years old at the time. She had been born in Houston on April 24, 1976. She met Jeff in 1997 while working as a waitress at a restaurant in Galveston. He was 29, 8 years older, outgoing and physically large, a man with a big personality who was known to drink heavily and had a history with cocaine. They began dating and she became pregnant. They married in 1998 while she was 8.5 months pregnant with their son Bradley. Their daughter Kaylee was born a couple of years later. From the outside, the neighborhood knew the Wrights as a young couple in a modest subdivision home with 2 small children and a dog and an ordinary life. Jeff had friends who liked him. His boss described him as stable and church-going, a very proud father. Friends called him a great guy who would do anything for you. Susan told a different story about the interior of that marriage, and she had been telling pieces of it to certain people for years. She said Jeff's cocaine use had never stopped. She said that when he was on it, he became violent and unpredictable, that he had beaten her repeatedly, that he controlled her in ways that made it impossible to leave. She said she had been to doctors with injuries. She said she had tried to keep it from their friends because Jeff had told her what would happen if she talked. She said the marriage was not the ordinary thing it appeared to be from the driveway. On the evening of January 13, 2003, Susan put Bradley and Kaylee to bed. Bradley was 4 years old. Kaylee was not yet 2. What happened next is the part of the case that produced 13 months of legal preparation, a nationally watched trial, a courtroom demonstration that made national headlines, and a verdict that divided public opinion in Texas for years. The prosecution's account went like this. Susan Wright seduced her husband. She used the promise of sex to get him into the bedroom, and she used the trust that came with that to persuade him to let her tie his wrists and ankles to the bedposts, which she did with neckties and a bathrobe sash. Once he was restrained and defenseless, she picked up a knife and stabbed him. Then she stabbed him again. She kept going. The prosecution's motive was a $200,000 life insurance policy Jeff had recently taken out. They argued that she had planned this. that the seduction and the restraints were part of the plan, and that the 193 wounds were not the product of fear or panic, but of sustained intent. Susan Wright's account was different. She said Jeff had come home that evening from a boxing lesson in an agitated state, already on cocaine. She said he had been with the children and had struck 4-year-old Bradley in the face during what he framed as playful roughhousing. She said she confronted him about his behaviour and told him he needed to get help and that this made him violent. She said he threw her onto the bed, raped her, and then left the room briefly. When he returned, she testified, he was holding a butcher knife and waving it over her, saying, "Die, bitch." She said she threw up her hands, managed to grab the knife during a struggle, and began stabbing him in the neck. She said she could not stop. She said she knew that if she stopped, he would get the knife back and kill her. She said she stabbed him until he was no longer moving, and then she tied one of his wrists to the bed, because even after everything, she was afraid he would come back. She told the jury she sat up all night beside the body, terrified he would revive. The following morning, she loaded him onto a dolly and wheeled him out to the backyard. Jeff had recently dug a hole near the patio to install a garden fountain. She put him in the hole, covered him with potting soil, and went back inside. She attempted to clean the room with bleach. She painted the wall. She cut out the section of carpet that could not be cleaned. She dragged the mattress and bedding outside. The day after the killing, January 15, 2003, Susan Wright went to the Harris County Constable's office and filed a domestic violence report against Jeff. She said he had assaulted her and struck their son. This report had the effect of explaining Jeff's absence from work and from his own family without raising immediate suspicion, because it positioned him as a man who had become violent, been confronted about it, and left. His brother filed a missing persons report a few days later when Jeff stopped returning calls. Harris County detectives went to speak with Susan on January 18th. She gave an initial denial. She then led them to the backyard. The body was already partially exposed. She was arrested and charged with murder. Her attorney, Neil Davis, had gone to the district attorney's office on the same day after Susan told him what was buried behind the house and had disclosed the existence of the body while protecting his client's statements under privilege. It was his call to investigators that had brought them to White Oak Bend. Susan turned herself in at the Harris County Courthouse on January 24th and was arraigned on murder charges the following Monday. She was released on bond. She also, at some point following the killing and before her arrest, entered a mental health facility. Prosecutor Siegler believed the sequence ran: kill Jeff, file the abuse report, retain a lawyer, enter the mental health facility to create distance from police. The defense maintained the sequence reflected a woman in genuine psychological collapse following a violent episode of self-defense. The trial opened February 24, 2004 at the Harris County Criminal Justice Center, with Siegler leading the prosecution. It became one of the most talked about trials in Texas that year, drawing standing room only attendance in the courtroom and national media coverage. Siegler's approach to the presentation of evidence was aggressive and theatrical by design. She brought the actual bed from the Wright home into the courtroom. During closing arguments with the bed set up before the jury, Siegler and a fellow prosecutor staged a physical demonstration, one straddling the other on the bed, to illustrate how Susan could have tied Jeff down and carried out the attack. The demonstration generated immediate controversy and immediate media coverage, with some legal commentators calling it inappropriate and others calling it effective. Defense attorney Neil Davis called it a circus. Prosecutor Siegler called it necessary. Jeff's friends and co-workers testified that he had been a good man, a devoted father, someone whose life had turned around for the positive when he met Susan. His boss said the Wrights were a Leave It to Beaver family. One longtime friend said he knew Jeff had struggled with drugs years earlier, but that the marriage had changed all of that. The defense countered with Susan's testimony about the years of abuse, her accounts of specific incidents, her descriptions of what the house was like when no one from the subdivision could see inside it. Her mother took the stand to say she had witnessed bruising on Susan's body. Siegler cross-examined Susan on her 2 months of work as a topless dancer before she met Jeff, in what the defense characterized as an attempt to undermine her credibility through irrelevant history. She pressed Susan on what she had said to get Jeff undressed and onto the bed, on what the candles were for, on why she had kept stabbing long past the point at which any genuine threat could have remained. Susan wept throughout the proceedings. The jury of 12 deliberated for 5.5 hours. On March 3, 2004, they returned a guilty verdict on the charge of murder. Prosecutors had asked for 55 years. Judge Jan Crocker sentenced Susan Wright to 25 years in prison. She appealed. The conviction was upheld in 2005 by the 14th Court of Appeals of Texas. In 2008, a new witness came forward during reappeal proceedings, Misty McMichael, formerly engaged to Jeff Wright before he met Susan, who testified that Jeff had been physically abusive to her throughout their 4-year relationship. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals in 2009 granted Wright a new sentencing hearing, finding that her trial counsel had rendered ineffective assistance during the punishment phase. On November 20, 2010, her original 25-year sentence was reduced to 20 years. She became parole eligible in 2014 and was denied twice, in June 2014 and July 2017. In July 2020, parole was granted. On December 30, 2020, Susan Wright was released from the Christina Melton Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas, at the age of 44, having served approximately 16 years. At the time of her release, she asked reporters to respect her family's privacy. She said she would just like a little quiet. Jeff Wright was 34 years old, Bradley was 4 years old, and Kaylee was not yet 2 when their father was buried in the backyard of the house where they lived. The hole he had dug for a garden fountain served as his grave for 5 days. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Susan Wright buried her husband in the backyard and told the children he had gone away. The next wife attended her husband's funeral, cried at the graveside, collected the inheritance, and spent 18 years making sure no one looked too closely at how he had actually died. Case 8. Carolyn Warmus. Betty Jean Solomon spent the evening of January 15, 1989, alone in the condominium she shared with her husband Paul in Greenburgh, New York, a Westchester County suburb about 20 miles north of Manhattan. She was 40 years old. She had grown up in Blauvelt, another Westchester town, the daughter of Jean and Robert Torrey. Her friends had called her BJ for most of her life. She was known among the people who loved her as someone who led with generosity, who gave others the benefit of the doubt before she gave herself any. She and Paul had a teenage daughter named Kristen. He taught 5th grade at Greenville Elementary School in Scarsdale. She worked to help keep the family financially stable. They had been married for nearly 20 years. That evening, Paul had gone out. Betty Jean did not have a car. Before he left, Paul had connected his own vehicle to a battery charger in a way that disabled it, then taken hers, leaving her without transportation and without any practical means of going anywhere, even if she had wanted to. It was a Sunday evening in January in a Westchester suburb, and she was alone in their apartment. At approximately 7:15 that evening, Betty Jean Solomon was shot 9 times. 4 of the shots hit her in the back. Others struck her legs and arms. She had been pistol whipped in the head before the shooting began. A telephone in the apartment had its cord yanked from the wall jack and was lying overturned on the living room floor. At some point during the attack, a New York telephone operator received a call from a distressed woman. The call disconnected abruptly. The operator alerted police, but the reverse directory had the wrong address for that phone number. And when officers responded, they arrived at an incorrect location and found nothing. Betty Jean Solomon was on the floor of her living room for hours before Paul Solomon came home and found her at 11:42 that night. He called the police. He gave them the wrong address first, delaying their arrival a second time. Paul Solomon was 44 years old. When investigators interviewed him, he laid out his evening. He said he had stopped by a local bowling alley around 6 p.m. and seen people there he recognised, though he had not bowled and had not stayed long. He said he then spent the evening at the Treetops Lounge of the Holiday Inn in Yonkers with a woman named Carolyn Warmus, a 25-year-old teacher who worked in a nearby school district. He said they stayed at the lounge until approximately 11 p.m. He said they then went to her car in the parking lot and had sex. He said he then drove home. Carolyn Warmus, when she was interviewed, confirmed this account. Witnesses at the Treetops Lounge also confirmed seeing both Paul and Carolyn there that evening. The initial investigation treated Paul Solomon as the most likely suspect. He was the husband. The marriage, as it turned out under questioning, had not been a faithful one, and by the end of his first round of investigative interviews, he had acknowledged a history of extramarital relationships, including the one with Warmus. His account of the evening had a particular quality to it, a sequence of stops and appearances that created witnesses to his presence at multiple locations without anchoring him precisely anywhere during the window when Betty Jean was shot. The bowling alley visit was brief and purposeless. The Treetops Lounge meeting happened at a time investigators noted was consistent with someone who had needed to be somewhere else first. But his alibi for the critical period was corroborated by Warmus and by the lounge witnesses, and investigators could not break it. Attention shifted in the months after the killing, and the shift was driven partly by what Carolyn Warmus did after Betty Jean's death. Paul Solomon, on the advice of his attorney, cut off contact with Warmus following the murder. He eventually took up with another woman. 5 months after Betty Jean died, Solomon and his new girlfriend travelled to Puerto Rico. Warmus went too. Solomon told investigators she had followed him there uninvited. Warmus maintained she had been invited. She called the new girlfriend's family and, according to investigators, impersonated a police officer in an attempt to get the woman to end her relationship with Solomon. She continued trying to reach him through various means, even as he made clear he wanted no contact. Detectives who were told about this behaviour began to reframe what they knew about the 18 months before the killing and what they now understood about the intensity of Carolyn Warmus's attachment to a married man who had been, at various points, trying to create distance from her. Carolyn Warmus was born January 8, 1964, in the Detroit area, the daughter of a multimillionaire insurance executive whose personal assets in 1989 were estimated at $150 million. Her parents divorced when she was 8, and she grew up in an affluent suburb of Detroit. She graduated from Seaholm High School in Birmingham with honours, earned a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Michigan, and then a master's degree in elementary education from Teachers College at Columbia University. She moved to New York City, taught in the Westchester County school system, and in September 1987 was assigned to Greenville Elementary School in Scarsdale, where she met Paul Solomon. He was 40, she was 23. He was married with a teenage daughter and had been at the school for years. What began as a collegial relationship became an affair that Warmus believed carried a future. Solomon told her, she said, that he planned to leave Betty Jean once Kristen graduated high school. Whether he said those words or not, it was the understanding Warmus operated on for the next year and a half. She moved to a different school district in 1988, but the affair continued. At some point that year, the relationship began to acquire complications. Solomon tried at various intervals to establish limits and pull back. Each time he did, Warmus's response was to find ways to close the distance again. Witnesses began to come forward during the investigation to say she had expressed hostility toward Betty Jean, had made comments that suggested she viewed the marriage as the thing standing between her and the life she wanted, and had discussed Betty Jean in terms that made the people who heard her uncomfortable. In the fall of 1988, she hired a private investigator named Vincent Parco, telling him she needed surveillance on Betty Jean Solomon, whom she described as jealous and potentially dangerous to her. This was the first time Parco's name appeared in the case. It was not the last. Parco testified that Carolyn Warmus came to him through a referral, that the framing she gave him for the surveillance work was that Betty Jean posed a threat, and that the relationship developed in a direction he had not anticipated. He said that, in early January 1989, approximately 1 week before Betty Jean was shot, Warmus purchased from him a .25 caliber Beretta pistol fitted with a silencer. She paid him $2,500 for it. Parco said she had raised the subject of obtaining a weapon on multiple previous occasions, and that he had put her off repeatedly before eventually agreeing to the transaction. He said the silencer had been his own suggestion, made on the theory that she could practice shooting in a house, garage, or wooded area without attracting attention. The murder weapon was never recovered, but the medical examiner confirmed that Betty Jean Solomon had been shot with .25 caliber rounds, the same caliber as the weapon Parko said he had sold to Warmus 1 week before the killing. The phone records deepened the picture. Detective Richard Constantino, reviewing calls made from Warmus's home phone on January 15, 1989, the day of the killing, found a call placed at 3:02 p.m. to Ray's Sport Shop in North Plainfield, New Jersey. Store records showed that the only woman to purchase .25 caliber ammunition at that shop that day had identified herself using the name Lisa Katai and a corresponding driver's license. When investigators found and interviewed Katai, she said she had never been to the store and had never purchased ammunition. She said her driver's license had been lost or stolen during a summer job she had held some time earlier. A check of that job's employment records showed that Carolyn Warmus had worked at the same location during the same period. The stolen identity used to buy the ammunition in New Jersey on the afternoon of the day Betty Jean Solomon was shot had been in the same workplace as the woman who was about to go on trial for the killing. Warmus was arrested in February 1990, 13 months after the murder. Her first trial opened January 14, 1991, before Judge John Carey in Westchester County Court in White Plains. It ran for more than 3 months and involved testimony from over 50 witnesses. Prosecutors James McCarty and Douglas Fitzmaurice built the case around Parko's testimony, the phone records, the ammunition purchase, and the behavioural pattern in the months leading up to the killing. Paul Solomon and Vincent Parko both received immunity for their testimony. The defence, led by attorney David Lewis, attacked Parko's credibility aggressively, arguing that he was not a reliable witness and raising the theory that Parko and Solomon had conspired together against Warmus. A defence witness named Joseph Lisella, a building contractor, testified that within an hour of the killing he had been in the men's room of a Yonkers bowling alley and overheard 2 men, one of whom he heard called Vinny and one called Paul, discussing a murder arrangement. The defence argued these were Parko and Solomon. The prosecution fought back on the phone records, with testimony from an MCI executive named Thomas Sable, who examined a second phone record the defence produced that lacked the New Jersey call and instead showed an additional call from Warmus's Manhattan apartment at 6:44 p.m, which would have made it logistically impossible for her to have been in Greenberg at 7:15 when Betty Jean was shot. Sable testified that this second phone record was a forgery. The jury heard 12 days of deliberation testimony, rehearing and reviewing the same material. After 12 days, they remained deadlocked, 8 voting to convict and 4 to acquit. Judge Carey declared a mistrial on April 27, 1991. 8 months later, the second trial began. There was new evidence this time, and it was the piece that would define the case for decades afterward. A black cashmere glove with a blood stain on it was introduced. Paul Solomon said he had found it at the crime scene after the first trial. The prosecution argued it belonged to Carolyn Warmus and that she had left it in the apartment on the night of the killing. The defence immediately raised the question every observer of the case would raise for the next 30 years. Why had the glove not been found during the original crime scene investigation, and why had it surfaced in Paul Solomon's possession between the first and second trials? Defence attorney William Aronwald told reporters the glove had not been available at the first trial and had then simply materialised, and he asked the jury to consider what that meant. No DNA testing of the glove was permitted at the second trial. The prosecution presented it as physical corroboration linking Warmus to the apartment on the night of the killing. The defence presented it as fabricated evidence from a man with substantial reason to redirect suspicion away from himself. The second trial lasted 5 months and involved 55 witnesses. Paul Solomon took the stand again and catalogued his marriage in the particular self-incriminating detail that only a witness with immunity can afford. He acknowledged multiple extramarital affairs. He acknowledged trying to end things with Warmus and failing to do so decisively. He acknowledged meeting her on the night his wife was shot and having sex with her in a parking lot afterward. When Warmus finally spoke at the second trial, breaking a silence she had maintained throughout both proceedings, she told the court through tears that if she was guilty of anything, it was the foolishness of believing the lies and promises Paul Solomon had made to her. The jury of 7 men and 5 women deliberated for 7 days. On May 27, 1992, they returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of second-degree murder and a separate charge of illegal possession of a firearm. Carolyn Warmus was 28 years old. She showed no visible emotion as the verdict was read. She had been smiling when she walked into the courtroom that morning on word that the jury had reached a decision. Judge John Carey sentenced her to 25 years to life in prison and a concurrent sentence of 5 to 15 years on the weapons charge. Her attorney, William Aronwald, announced on the day of sentencing a reward of $250,000 offered by the Warmus family for any information identifying the actual perpetrator. Betty Jean's sister Joyce Green called the offer bogus and said the evidence against Warmus had been strong. She was incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in Westchester County, the same facility that held Pamela Smart. She was denied parole multiple times, receiving disciplinary notations that were referenced in at least one denial. She maintained her innocence through every parole hearing and every legal filing over 27 years. In 2017, she requested DNA testing of the glove, the semen recovered from Betty Jean, and blood found in a tote bag belonging to Paul Solomon. The request went through a protracted legal process. In May 2021, Westchester County District Attorney Mimi Roker consented to DNA testing on all 3 pieces of evidence. The results of that testing have not, as of the time of this production, resolved the case in any public direction. On June 17, 2019, Carolyn Warmus was released on parole after serving 27 years. She was 55 years old. Under New York law, she will remain subject to parole supervision for the rest of her life, unless the conviction is overturned. She continues to seek exoneration. Paul Solomon has declined every request for media interviews since the verdict in 1992. He was removed from his classroom duties following the first trial and eventually reassigned to non-teaching work within the same school district. He has never been charged in connection with his wife's death. Betty Jean Solomon was 40 years old. Her daughter Kristen was 15 when her mother's body was found on the living room floor of the apartment where the family lived. The friends who knew Betty Jean described her to reporters and investigators as a generous woman who gave people the benefit of the doubt. No one extended that courtesy to her on the evening of January 15, 1989. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Carolyn Warmus sat across from Paul Solomon that night at a bar in Yonkers and spent hours maintaining the cover that would hold for 13 months before anyone charged her. The next case is different from everything on this list. The bodies were in the front yard the whole time, buried beneath a garden ornament the woman had built herself, and investigators only found them because an anonymous tip told them exactly where to dig. Case 9. Betty Lou Beets. The wishing well was in the front yard. Jimmy Don Beets had built it himself, a decorative garden structure planted at the edge of the lawn of the property he shared with Betty Lou near Cedar Creek Lake in Henderson County, East Texas. He had built it for her. The lake house sat in the small community of Gun Barrel City, about 70 miles southeast of Dallas, and the wishing well was one of those touches that made the place feel permanent, the kind of thing a man puts in the yard when he intends to stay. Jimmy Don Beets was a retired Dallas fire captain, 47 years old, a man with a pension and a reputation and a history of good standing with everyone who knew him. He and Betty Lou had married in 1982. By the summer of 1983, they had been together a little over a year. On August 6, 1983, Betty Lou Beets called the Henderson County Sheriff's Department and reported her husband missing. She told investigators he had gone out alone on his fishing boat on Cedar Creek Lake and had not come back. She said he had heart trouble and liked to fish by himself. 6 days later, his boat surfaced near the Redwood Beach Marina, washed ashore and drifting. Scattered inside were his nitroglycerine heart medication pills, his fishing license, and the life jacket. Jimmy Don was not there. Investigators spent 3 weeks dragging sections of the lake. They found nothing. The prevailing conclusion was that a man with a documented heart condition had suffered an episode on the water, gone overboard, and drowned, and that the lake had taken him. Cedar Creek Lake in Henderson County was not an unusual place for a fishing accident. The search was suspended. The case was treated as a drowning. Betty Lou did not waste time. Within weeks of reporting her husband missing, she had begun the process of applying for his Dallas Fire Department pension, which paid approximately $1,200 per month. Records later surfaced showing she had also previously attempted to take out a $10,000 life insurance policy on Jimmy Don without his knowledge, though that policy had not been completed before his death. She also sold his boat approximately a year after he disappeared, once the search had been formally closed and there was no longer any official scrutiny of the property. She moved forward. What had actually happened on the evening of August 6, 1983, was known by at least 3 people from the night it occurred. Betty Lou Beets had shot Jimmy Don twice in the head at close range while he slept. Her son, Robert Branson, had been in the house when she told him what she intended to do. She instructed him to leave. He did. He returned approximately 2 hours later and found Jimmy Don dead. Robert then helped his mother move the body. They wrapped it and placed it in the hole beneath the ornamental wishing well in the front yard, the structure Jimmy Don had built with his own hands and set in the ground as a fixture of the home they shared. They packed it back in and covered it over. The following morning, on Betty Lou's instructions, Robert went to the marina with Jimmy Don's boat. He scattered the heart medication pills inside it, removed the propeller from the motor so the boat would appear to have been drifting disabled on the water, and pushed it out. 6 days later, it washed ashore, and the sheriff's department arrived. Robert Branson was not the only one of Betty Lou's children who knew what was happening on that property. Her daughter, Shirley Stegner, testified later that Betty Lou had called her on the evening of August 6, 1983. When Shirley asked her mother whether the plan to kill Jimmy Don had been carried out, Betty Lou told her it had been. She told Shirley everything was taken care of. Several weeks later, Betty Lou told Shirley directly that she and Robert had buried Jimmy Don in the wishing well, and Shirley knew something else from 2 years earlier. In October 1981, Betty Lou had told her daughter, while they sat around a campfire at the property, that she was going to kill Doyle Wayne Barker because she could not put up with him any longer. Doyle Wayne Barker was Betty Lou's 4th husband. He disappeared in 1981, reported missing by Betty Lou, with no body found and no investigation that went anywhere. Shirley told investigators that she had helped her mother bury Barker's body at the same property in 1981. Barker was under the shed in the backyard. Jimmy Don was under the wishing well in the front yard. Both men had been shot with a .38 caliber pistol. Both had been buried on the same piece of land. Both had been reported missing by the same woman. Neither had been found. Betty Lou Beets was born Betty Lou Dunavant in Roxborough, North Carolina, on March 12, 1937. Her childhood was defined by violence and poverty from the start. She later said her father had sexually abused her beginning at age 5. At 6, she was rendered nearly deaf by meningitis, a condition she carried for the rest of her life. Her mother was institutionalized when Betty Lou was 12, leaving her to take care of her younger siblings. She married for the first time at 15 and did not stop. Over the course of her life, she would marry 7 times, twice to the same man. The record of those marriages, as it was eventually assembled and placed before a jury, was a ledger of recurring violence and financial desperation running from North Carolina through Virginia into Texas across 3 decades. Her second husband, Bill Lane, was shot by Betty Lou in 1970. She put 2 bullets in his back. He survived. He later testified at her murder trial. She was acquitted because Lane himself admitted he had threatened her life first. The 2 remarried within weeks and divorced again within a month of the remarriage. In 1978, she attempted to run over her 3rd husband, Ronnie Threlcold, with a car. He also survived. He also testified against her. Her 4th husband, Doyle Wayne Barker, did not survive. By the time investigators found him under the shed in Gun Barrel City in 1985, he had been there for approximately 4 years. Betty Lou had collected benefits connected to his estate and moved on. Jimmy Don Beets was the 5th. He had been in the front yard for 2 years. The case broke in June 1985, not through any investigative development but through a tip. A man who had been having an affair with Betty Lou came forward to tell authorities what she had revealed to him one night after heavy drinking. She had told him, in his account, that the last man she had been with, she had killed and buried in the front yard. Investigators turned to her children to corroborate it. Daughter Phyllis confirmed she knew. Shirley confirmed it and went further, providing details about both deaths and her own role in burying Barker. And Robert Branson, who had walked out of that house at his mother's instruction on the night of August 6, 1983, and come back 2 hours later to find Jimmy Don dead, told investigators everything. Before the arrest was formally processed, an unrelated incident at the property gave investigators an unexpected evidentiary gift. Betty Lou's younger son got into an argument with her then-boyfriend Ray, a convicted felon on parole, and the argument escalated to the point where the son grabbed guns from inside the house and shot out the tyres on Ray's vehicle. Officers responded and collected several firearms from the property as part of that incident, including a .38 caliber revolver. The .38 caliber revolver was later matched through ballistics analysis to the bullets recovered from both Jimmy Don Beets and Doyle Wayne Barker. The same gun, the same property, two men, buried years apart, both shot with the weapons sitting in the house. Betty Lou Beets was arrested on June 8, 1985, by officers of the Mansfield Police Department and booked into the Henderson County Jail. Investigators executed a search warrant on the property. They dug up the front yard and found Jimmy Don Beets beneath the wishing well, exactly where Robert Branson had said he would be. He had been shot twice in the head at close range. They kept digging and found Doyle Wayne Barker under the storage shed in the backyard, shot in the head as well. The dental records confirmed both identifications. Investigators recovered 2 bullets from Jimmy Don and 3 from Barker. All 5 were identified as .38 caliber projectiles consistent with the revolver seized during the unrelated incident with Betty Lou's son. Every piece of physical evidence connected to Betty Lou Beets in a direct line from the bodies in the ground, to the gun in the house, to the woman who had been sleeping in it. She was charged with capital murder in the death of Jimmy Don Beets. Texas law permitted a capital murder charge when a killing was committed for remuneration, meaning for financial gain, and prosecutors framed the case precisely that way. She had shot Jimmy Don to access his fire department pension and to collect the insurance benefits she had been quietly manoeuvring toward since before he was reported missing. She was never charged with the death of Doyle Wayne Barker. Prosecutors had what they needed from the Jimmy Don case alone and chose not to build a second proceeding around a death for which the evidence, while substantial, ran primarily through the same witnesses they were already calling. Her trial opened in the 173rd District Court of Henderson County on July 11, 1985. She pleaded not guilty. The defense strategy that was deployed on her behalf was to shift blame directly onto her own children. Betty Lou took the stand and accused Robert of having shot Jimmy Don himself. Robert denied it and described in detail the events of the evening of August 6th, the conversation in which his mother told him her intentions, the instruction to leave the house, the 2 hours he spent away, his return, the sight of Jimmy Don dead, and the work of moving and burying the body in the wishing well that Jimmy Don had built for her. Shirley testified about what Betty Lou had told her by phone that same evening, about the conversation by the campfire in 1981, when her mother described her intentions toward Doyle Barker, and about helping bury Barker's body herself. The prosecution also called witnesses who testified about Betty Lou's immediate and sustained efforts to access Jimmy Don's pension and insurance from the weeks following his disappearance through the months after his boat was found. The jury convicted Betty Lou Beets of capital murder on October 11, 1985, after 4 hours of deliberation. 3 days later, during the penalty phase of the same proceedings, they sentenced her to death. What the jury did not hear, and what would become the central argument of her appeals for the next 15 years, was any account of the life Betty Lou Beets had lived before she arrived in Henderson County. The history of abuse that began when she was 5 years old, the institutionalized mother, the string of violent husbands, the head injuries that had accumulated across decades of marriages, the documented pattern of victimization that preceded and framed every violent act she had been part of in her adult life. None of it was presented to the jury that decided whether she would live or die. Her trial attorney, it later emerged, had secured an agreement from Betty Lou, giving him all media rights to her story before the trial began. This arrangement created a direct conflict of interest. He was the only person who could have testified that Betty Lou had not learned about Jimmy Don's pension and insurance benefits until more than a year after his death, when she had first come to him for help with an unrelated fire insurance claim. Rather than withdraw from the representation and provide that testimony, he kept the case and kept the media rights. He was later disbarred and imprisoned on unrelated charges. The appeals that followed covered essentially the full range of constitutional arguments available to a capital defendant. In 1991, a federal district court judge ruled that the trial attorney's conduct had violated Betty Lou's Sixth Amendment right to adequate counsel and ordered a new trial. Texas appealed. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the ruling and reinstated the death sentence. Her attorneys argued that the Supreme Court's established requirements in capital cases meant a jury must hear mitigating evidence before imposing death, and that the complete failure to present her history of abuse violated those requirements. The courts denied that argument through the various levels of the federal appellate system. Every avenue closed. In February 2000, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted 15-0 against clemency. Governor George W. Bush, who had never in his tenure granted a 30-day reprieve, declined to act. He issued a statement saying that, after careful review of the evidence, he agreed with the jury that Betty Lou Beets was guilty of the murder and was confident that the courts had thoroughly reviewed all issues raised on her behalf. On February 24, 2000, Betty Lou Beets was taken to the Huntsville unit. She was 62 years old. She was a great-grandmother. She did not request a final meal. She made no final statement. She smiled briefly toward a preacher who was among the witnesses in the chamber. She was pronounced dead at 6:18 p.m. after receiving a lethal injection. She was the second woman executed in Texas since the reinstatement of the death penalty, and only the fourth executed in the United States since 1976. Jimmy Don Beets' son, Jamie, witnessed the execution from the observation room and told reporters afterward that she had shown no fear and no remorse as she lay on the gurney. Robert Branson and Shirley Stegner, the two children who had helped bury the bodies and who had then testified against their mother, had taken plea arrangements in exchange for their cooperation. Both had been charged for their roles in concealing what happened at that property. Their own reckoning with what they had participated in, what they had known, what they had been part of, was something the legal record captured in outline only. What it felt like to be the son who came home 2 hours later and found Jimmy Don dead, who then helped put the body in the ground beneath the thing the dead man had built for his wife. The record does not say. Jimmy Don Beets had been a Dallas fire captain. He had retired and moved to the lake. He built a wishing well in his front yard. He was 47 years old. Doyle Wayne Barker had been Betty Lou's fourth husband, and he had been under the shed in the backyard for 4 years by the time anyone knew to look. His name appeared in the indictment, in the search warrant, in the forensic report, and in the ground. He was never the subject of a trial. Nobody was ever convicted of what had been done to him. The two men had one thing in common beyond the method and the location of their deaths. They had both said yes when Betty Lou asked them to marry her. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Betty Lou Beets buried 2 husbands on the same property and spent 2 years collecting one man's pension before a tip from her own son gave investigators a reason to dig. The final case on this list starts with a duck hunting trip, a body that was never in the lake everyone searched, and a woman who maintained her story for 17 years until the man she married next decided he had more to lose by staying quiet than by talking. Case 10, Denise Williams. Mike Williams and Denise Merrill grew up together. They attended North Florida Christian High School in Tallahassee, Florida, where he played football and she was a cheerleader, which was the kind of origin story that people in a small city remember about a couple for the rest of their lives. They went on to Florida State University together. They graduated. They got married on December 16, 1994. He became a property appraiser, working for a real estate firm and building a professional reputation in a city where everyone knew everyone else's business. She became a certified public accountant. In May 1999, their daughter Ansley was born. By late 2000, They were settled into a house on Centennial Oak Circle in a quiet Tallahassee neighborhood, and by the accounts of the people around them, they were thinking about having a second child. They had plans to celebrate their 6th wedding anniversary on the evening of December 16, 2000. Mike Williams left the house before dawn that morning. He had a boat on a trailer behind his truck, and he was driving northwest toward Lake Seminole, a large reservoir sitting on the Florida-Georgia border about 50 miles from Tallahassee. The lake was familiar to him. He had hunted duck there for years with the same circle of friends, and the December season was something he looked forward to. He told Denise he would be home by noon. He told his mother and his brother 2 days before the trip that he and Denise were planning to have another child soon. He was 31 years old. He was driving toward a lake he had been to dozens of times with a man he had known since they were boys. He never came home. By noon, Denise called her father to say Mike had not returned. A large-scale search was organized, involving local law enforcement, state resources, and volunteers. His boat was found near a remote boat launch on the Florida side of Lake Seminole in Jackson County, his duck decoys and shotgun still inside. The lake was dragged and searched. Nothing was found. Investigators noted that the lake had a significant alligator population, and in the absence of any other evidence, concluded that Mike Williams had likely fallen overboard and drowned, and that the alligator activity in the area had consumed whatever the water had not taken. It was, on its surface, a plausible explanation for why no body had been found. It was also, as an alligator expert would later confirm to Mike's mother when she sought out specialists herself, virtually impossible. Alligators do not feed during the cold winter months. They are not active in December in North Florida. A total consumption of a human body, leaving no forensic trace behind, is not how alligator predation works, and anyone with expertise in the subject could have said so from the beginning. Nobody with that expertise was consulted in the original investigation. Denise Williams petitioned the court to have Mike declared legally dead. A Leon County judge granted the petition in July 2001, approximately 19 days before a scheduled insurance hearing. She collected $1.75 million from 3 life insurance policies taken out on Mike's life. The policies had been written through Brian Winchester, a man who had been Mike Williams's closest childhood friend, who had gone to the same schools, who had hunted the same lakes, who had sold Mike a $250,000 policy years earlier, and then, after Ansley was born, had sold him a $1 million policy at Mike and Denise's request. Winchester had said at the time that he recommended the larger policy because Mike had a young daughter and wanted to provide for her. The policy was issued through Winchester's insurance practice. Within a few years of Mike's disappearance, Brian Winchester and Denise Williams were married. What Brian Winchester told investigators 17 years later, in the confession that finally cracked the case, was that he and Denise had been having a secret affair since 1997. Mike Williams had known nothing about it. Neither had Winchester's then-wife, Kathy. The 4 of them socialized regularly as couples, went to each other's houses, celebrated their children together. Kathy Winchester later told the jury at Denise's trial that she had suspected something in the late 1990s when the 4 of them frequently double-dated, and she noticed things she could not quite name. Brian said in his confession that the affair had started in 1997 and had just, in his word, snowballed. By late 1999 or early 2000, the situation had reached a point where he and Denise were discussing what to do about it. Denise, Winchester said, would not file for divorce. Her family held religious convictions that made divorce unacceptable. She also feared that a custody arrangement for Ansley would not go the way she wanted. The solution they arrived at was to make Mike disappear in a way that would look like an accident and produce a life insurance payout. Winchester said they had at one point discussed a plan involving both spouses, pushing Mike and Kathy overboard from a boat on the Gulf of Mexico, but he had refused to include Kathy because she was the mother of his children. They settled on a drowning staged as a hunting accident on a lake where the alligator population could absorb the absence of a body. The timing was determined by duck hunting season and by the approaching expiration of one of the life insurance policies. They originally chose December 9th, 2000 as the date. The night before, Denise called it off. She had gotten cold feet. 1 week later, she made sure Mike went. The night before the December 16th trip, Winchester gave Kathy a sedative to ensure she would not hear him leave before dawn. He met Mike at a gas station in Tallahassee and followed him to the lake. They launched the boat together in the pre-dawn darkness, two men who had been best friends since childhood, heading out onto water they had hunted dozens of times before. When they reached a deep section of the lake, Winchester got Mike to stand up in the boat and pushed him overboard. The plan was for Mike to drown. Mike Williams did not drown. He got out of his waders in the water, swam to a floating tree stump, and called out for help. Winchester circled the boat. He said later that he panicked, that none of it was going the way it was supposed to go, that he did not know what to do. He loaded the shotgun he had brought with him. He made 1 or 2 passes around the stump. Then he shot Mike Williams in the face with a 12-gauge shotgun and watched him go under. Winchester dragged the body to shore. He loaded it into his truck. He drove home to Tallahassee, returned to bed beside Kathy in order to establish his alibi, then later that day drove to the end of a dead-end road north of the city and buried Mike Williams in the ground. He then drove back to the lake and joined the search party that had organised after Denise reported Mike missing. He was the one who found the empty boat near the launch. Mike Williams was not in Lake Seminole. He had never been in Lake Seminole. He had been in the ground north of Tallahassee for 17 years before anyone knew to look for him there. Mike's mother, Cheryl Williams, never accepted the official conclusion. From the first weeks after the disappearance, she had been asking questions that the investigation was not answering. She compiled 27 pages of single-spaced notes and observations, documenting inconsistencies and unanswered questions about the case. She wrote letters to Florida's governor, eventually sending more than 1,400 of them over the years, asking for the investigation to be reopened. She put up billboards. She ran advertisements in the Tallahassee Democrat. She hired a private search team. She contacted alligator experts who told her that the predation theory was virtually impossible given the time of year. She consulted with anyone who would listen and a number of people who would not. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement reopened the investigation in 2004, based in part on her efforts and on growing awareness that the alligator explanation could not hold up to scientific scrutiny. But the investigation found nothing actionable, and the file went quiet again. By 2006, FDLE cold case investigators had stopped returning Cheryl's phone calls. Meanwhile, Denise had been threatening Cheryl for years to stop publicly pressing for answers. She told her mother-in-law that Cheryl's continued advocacy was confusing Ansley, making the child think her father might still be alive. Denise told Cheryl that if she did not stop, she would cut off her access to her granddaughter. And then she did. Ansley Williams grew up without her father and, for significant stretches, without her paternal grandmother, because the woman who had helped arrange her father's death did not want Cheryl Williams asking questions in public. The break came from a direction no one had predicted. Brian Winchester and Denise Williams' marriage deteriorated badly in the years following their 2005 wedding. By 2015, she had filed for divorce. In 2016, Winchester was arrested for kidnapping Denise at gunpoint, forcing her into her own car at a parking lot and holding her there. He was charged, convicted, and sentenced to 20 years in prison for the kidnapping. The day after he was sentenced, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement held a press conference and announced that the remains of Mike Williams had been located north of Tallahassee. Winchester had told investigators where to look in exchange for immunity from prosecution in the murder. He led them to the end of a dead-end road in Leon County. Mike Williams was found there, 17 years after the morning he drove toward Lake Seminole before it was light outside. He had been shot in the face, buried in the ground, and left beneath the surface of a city he had spent his whole life in. Denise Williams was arrested on May 8, 2018, intercepted while returning home from a university visit, and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. Her trial opened December 11, 2018, in Tallahassee, before Judge James Hankinson. The prosecution was led by Assistant State Attorney John Fuchs, who told the jury in his opening statement that Denise Williams liked the sound of being a widow considerably more than the sound of being a divorcee, and that to achieve the first, you could not be caught doing what it took to get there. Winchester took the stand and testified in detail. He described the affair beginning in 1997. He described the planning that ran through 2000. He described the morning on the lake, pushing Mike overboard, the panic when Mike refused to drown, the shotgun, the body, the burial. He broke down at multiple points during his testimony. When he described his father joining the search party at the lake and his father not knowing what Brian had done, he could not continue for several moments. He described himself and Denise as partners in crime, using the phrase Bonnie and Clyde to characterize the nature of the arrangement between them. He said the insurance money had been, in his words, a bonus, icing on the cake. He said the reason he had committed the crime was to be with Denise. He said they had made an agreement that as long as neither of them talked, nobody would ever find out what happened. Under cross-examination by defense attorney Ethan Way, Winchester acknowledged the full weight of the defense's position. Way asked him directly whether Denise had been present at the lake when he shot Mike. Winchester said she had not. He acknowledged she had not been on the phone with him during the killing. He acknowledged that she had not known, in the specific moment, that he was going to shoot Mike in the face with a shotgun. Way asked whether it was fair to say Denise had no idea that he had shot her husband in that manner. Winchester confirmed it. The defense argued that Winchester, a confessed murderer testifying under a grant of immunity, was the only witness placing Denise inside the planning of the crime, that there was no physical evidence connecting her to the act, and that the jury was being asked to convict a woman on the word of the man who had actually pulled the trigger and who had received immunity from prosecution in exchange for his cooperation. The prosecution countered with a recorded phone call in which a woman working with investigators had raised the subject of Mike Williams' disappearance in conversation with Denise. Every time the subject came up, Denise deflected it or tried to redirect. At one point, she asked what the woman knew. Fuchs pointed to Denise's response in the courtroom during Winchester's testimony as the prosecution's most powerful argument. He told the jury in closing that everyone in the room had been moved by what Winchester described, by the sheer horror of a man being shot in the face by his best friend in a lake they had hunted together since they were boys. Everyone had reacted, except one person. Denise Williams sat through it, he told the jury. Stone-faced, did not bat an eye, did not shed a tear. Fuchs told the jury that was not the reaction of a woman hearing for the first time what had happened to her husband. That was the reaction of a woman who already knew. Cheryl Williams testified for the prosecution as well. Fuchs asked her whether she had ever believed the alligator theory. She said no. He asked how long she had been waiting for Denise to call her and say she was sorry for doubting her all these years. Cheryl Williams said Denise had never called. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. On December 15, 2018, they returned a unanimous verdict of guilty on all 3 counts: conspiracy to commit murder, first-degree murder, and accessory after the fact. In January 2019, Judge Hankinson sentenced Denise Williams to life in prison. She did not speak at the sentencing. She offered no statement. The only person other than the attorneys to address the court was Cheryl Williams, who said that justice had finally been served, and that Denise had taken not only her son, but also her granddaughter from her. Denise Williams appealed. In November 2020, Florida's First District Court of Appeal overturned the first-degree murder conviction, ruling that while the evidence established her intent to conspire, it was insufficient to establish direct participation in the commission of the act itself. The conspiracy conviction was upheld. She was resentenced in September 2021 to 30 years on the conspiracy charge. The sentencing judge, in ruling on the resentencing, said he did not find Denise Williams to have been a minor participant in what had occurred, and that the truth was she could have stopped it. Florida's Attorney General appealed the reversal of the murder conviction to the state Supreme Court. The court declined to hear the case. As of September 2025, Denise Williams, then 55 years old, was imprisoned at the Florida Women's Reception Center with a scheduled release date of March 31, 2046. 5 months after her murder conviction, Denise signed over all of her assets to Ansley in order to avoid prosecution on 3 additional counts of insurance fraud. Mike's estate, the properties, the insurance money that had been paid out after a judge declared him legally dead based on a drowning theory that an alligator expert could have dismantled in 10 minutes. All of it transferred to his daughter. Under the terms of the agreement, Ansley Williams cannot use any of the money toward her mother's legal costs. If she does, she faces a $150,000 penalty. The money that changed hands because Mike Williams was shot in the face on a lake north of Tallahassee now belongs to his daughter, and it cannot be spent on the woman who made the phone call to confirm he would go hunting that morning. Ansley Williams was 18 months old when her father drove away before dawn on December 16, 2000. She grew up in Tallahassee, attended Florida State University and then the University of Florida, earned 2 degrees, and as of 2025 was working in business strategy and communications in the city where her parents grew up together. After her mother's imprisonment, Ansley was raised in significant part by Cheryl Williams, the grandmother who had spent 18 years writing letters to governors and running advertisements and compiling 27 pages of notes and standing at press conferences and refusing to stop asking where her son was. Mike Williams was 31 years old. He had been looking forward to his duck hunting trip and his anniversary dinner and the possibility of another child. His best friend drove him to the lake and shot him in the face because a woman they both loved liked the sound of widow better than divorce. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.